The 2015 Accommodations for Students with Disabilities Training. About this training, these slides are intended to provide a general overview of the accommodation policies. This is a comprehensive training but does not take the place of reading the associated documents. Relevant district and campus staff will need to read all of the policies and related resources once they are posted on the Accommodations for Students with Disabilities webpage. These documents contain all the details. TEA has a new website. To access the accommodation resources, please go to the link below. Click on 2015 Accommodations for Students with Disabilities Taking State Assessments. Critical information about accommodations for students with disabilities. Students with disabilities. A student may be eligible for accommodations on a state assessment if he or she receives special education services and meets established eligibility criteria for certain accommodations, receives Section 504 services and meets established eligibility criteria for certain accommodations, does not receive special education or Section 504 services but has a disabling condition and meets established eligibility criteria for certain accommodations. Accommodations should be individualized to address the specific needs of each student, might be appropriate for classroom use but might not be appropriate or allowed for use on a state assessment, should be evaluated regularly to determine effectiveness and to help plan for accommodations the student will need each year, should be documented in the appropriate student paperwork. Accommodations are not necessary for every student. Accommodations are not changes to the performance criteria or the content. Accommodations are not intended to provide an advantage to a student with a disability, and accommodations should not be provided to a student without evidence of effectiveness from year to year. Classroom instruction versus state assessment. Not all accommodations suitable for instruction are allowed during the state assessments. Why? Classroom instruction can be customized to meet the needs of each student. The state assessment is a standardized tool for measuring every student's learning in a reliable, valid, and secure manner. Certain accommodations used in the classroom would invalidate the content being assessed or compromise the security and integrity of the state assessment. But state testing accommodation policies do not limit an educator's ability to develop individualized materials and techniques to facilitate student learning. Routinely used accommodations. What does routinely used mean? The student should routinely receive the accommodation during classroom instruction and testing. The student has used the accommodation often enough that he or she is comfortable using it on the day of the state assessment. This does not necessarily mean that the accommodation must be used every day during instruction. The student should be able to use the accommodation independently when applicable during the state assessment. For accommodations where independence is applicable, there should be no need for teacher assistance when using the accommodation. Accommodation is effective. How do I know the accommodation has proven effective in meeting the student's specific needs? Educators should collect and analyze data pertaining to the use and effectiveness of accommodations. For example, assignments, test scores with and without the accommodation, observational reports. This data will show whether the student still needs the accommodation or whether it is now unnecessary. Accommodation triangle. Type 1 accommodations are approved locally based on specific eligibility criteria. The decision to provide these accommodations is made by the appropriate team of people at the campus level. ARD Committee, Section 504 Placement Committee, RTI Team, Student Assistance Team. Type 2 accommodations require TEA approval to use during a state assessment. The appropriate team of people at the campus level determine whether the student meets all of the eligibility criteria and if so, submits an accommodation request form to TEA. Accommodations in emergency or unexpected situations. This information is now in a separate document on the Accommodations webpage. Follow these steps when unexpected or emergency situations like a broken arm or lost eyeglasses occur just prior to or on the day of the state assessment. Contact your campus testing coordinator. The campus testing coordinator can make available test administration procedures and materials allowable for any student, make available Type 1 accommodations. Consideration should be given to accommodations that the student can independently use. For example, for the student who does not have his or her prescribed eyeglasses, consider use of a projection device or a large print test booklet prior to considering an oral administration by a test administrator. If the student needs cannot be met with available test administration procedures or materials, nor Type 1 accommodations, the campus testing coordinator must contact the district for further guidance. There is no expectation that the student would have routinely received the procedure, material, or accommodation during previous classroom instruction and testing. It is recommended that the student and the test administrator, if applicable, can be given the opportunity to practice using the new accommodation prior to testing if time permits. The 2015 Accommodation Policy. The accommodation policies follow a standard format. At the top, the accommodation type is listed 1 or 2. Description of accommodation. This section provides a general description of the accommodation. Assessments. This section lists the assessments the accommodation may be used on by eligible students. Student eligibility criteria. This section lists the eligibility criteria that must be met in order for the student to use the accommodation on a state assessment. Authority for decision and required documentation. This section describes who can make accommodation decisions for students, where to document these decisions, and what to record on the answer document. This icon indicates whether or not an accommodation request form is required. Examples and types. This section describes the specific examples and types of the accommodation that may be used on the state assessment. Pay careful attention to this list because it is sometimes exhaustive. Special instructions and considerations. This section outlines special instructions and considerations about the accommodation that educators must be aware of when making the decision to use the accommodation and when administering the assessment with the accommodation. Accommodations available under Type 1, individualized structured reminders, amplification devices, projection devices, manipulating test materials, signed oral administration, spelling assistance, math manipulatives, calculation devices, basic transcribing, supplemental aids, extra time, dictionary, or braille. Type 2, complex transcribing, math scribe, photocopy, extra day, or other. Type 1 accommodations. Individualized structured reminders. This accommodation is for students needing more structured reminders to stay on task during state testing and can include, but is not limited to, paper clips to divide tests into sections, structured reminders that are part of a behavior plan, personal timers. Any student can receive this accommodation if he or she meets the eligibility criteria. Special consideration. General reminders to stay on task, for example, taps on the shoulder and reminders to keep working, are allowable for any student. Amplification devices. This accommodation is for students whose disability affects hearing or focus and can include, but is not limited to, speakers, frequency modulated system. Projection devices. This accommodation allows for enlarging text, graphics, or the display on a computer monitor and can include, but is not limited to, closed-circuit television or LCD projector. Special considerations. Secure test materials cannot be saved in any way. Local responsibility to ensure that devices with recording capabilities have that capability disabled. If secure test materials must be photocopied in order to use this accommodation, refer to the photocopy accommodation policy. Manipulating test materials. This accommodation allows for the test administrator to physically manipulate materials and equipment for a student and can include, but is not limited to, turning test booklet pages, positioning the ruler, using the mouse to navigate the pages, and operate the tools for an online administration. Special consideration. The student must give specific directions about how the test administrator should manipulate the materials or equipment. Test administrators must sign the oath of test security, including the bottom section. If a student needs his or her responses to test questions transcribed onto an answer document or into the assessment management system for online administrations, please refer to the basic transcribing or complex transcribing accommodation policies. Oral or signed administration have changed for 2015. This accommodation applies to the entire mathematics, science, and social studies tests, any reading questions on all reading or English tests, any resource materials like dictionaries or allowable accommodations like supplemental aids. This accommodation never applies to reading selections, writing selections, or writing multiple choice test questions. Why can't I read aloud the selections on a reading test? Reading aloud the STAR reading selections at any grade makes the assessment an inappropriate and invalid measure, since no determination about a student's reading comprehension can be made. The purpose of STAR is to assess the degree to which students understand what they read. It is not intended to be a measure of listening comprehension, which is distinctly different from reading comprehension. For this reason, students are required to read the selections independently on the STAR reading tests. Why can't I read aloud selections and questions on a writing test? There are practical considerations unique to the writing test that make reading aloud the writing selections and answer choices by a human reader problematic. For example, misspelled words and missing punctuation make it difficult for a human reader to read the test. A student may use this accommodation if he or she routinely and effectively uses this accommodation during classroom instruction and testing and meets at least one of the following: special education, identify with dyslexia or a related disorder, or evidence of reading difficulties. Section 504, identify with dyslexia or related disorder, or evidence of reading difficulties. General education, identified with dyslexia or related disorder. Test administrators must be trained in the procedures specific to an oral administration. General guidelines for providing an oral administration and specific instructions for reading aloud various types of test questions can be found in the Oral Signed Administration Appendix of the appropriate test administrator manual. Oral administration can include different levels of reading support for each eligible student. The test administrator may read parts of the test questions and answer choices at student request, or they may read all test questions and answer choices throughout the test. Document the level of reading support the student needs in the appropriate student paperwork. A student can request a change to the level of reading support provided during testing only if this option is documented. Standardized oral administration is available in the following grades and subjects for students eligible. The online tool through which SOA is delivered allows a student to independently select and change his or her level of reading support during the test administration. SOA should only be administered to an eligible student for whom the appropriateness of this type of oral administration has been discussed and documented. It's recommended that students complete the online tutorial prior to test administration. This tutorial allows students to become familiar with the tools available to them during the online SOA test session. Text-to-speech function in STAR-L. The embedded text-to-speech tool in STAR-L reads aloud individual words as a student clicks on them. If this type of reading support is sufficient, students who meet the eligibility requirements for STAR-L do not have to be eligible for an oral administration as well. However, because the purpose of the tool is to help students decode words in English, the tool does not read aloud numbers, symbols, equations, or multiple words at a time. Therefore, if a student needs all of the test questions and answer choices throughout the test read aloud, he or she must be eligible for oral administration as an accommodation. It's important to note that a test administrator may provide assigned administration of STAR-L if needed. It's recommended that students complete the applicable online tutorial prior to test administration. This tutorial allows students to become familiar with the tools available to them during the online STAR-L test session. Text-to-speech function in STAR-A. Students who meet the eligibility requirements for STAR-A do not have to be eligible for an oral administration. This is an embedded accommodation within STAR-A. The online tool through which STAR-A is delivered allows a student to independently select various levels of reading support during the test administration. It's important to note that a test administrator may provide assigned administration of STAR-A if needed. It's recommended that students complete the online tutorial prior to test administration. This tutorial allows students to become familiar with the tools available to them during the online STAR-A test session. Test administrators must sign the oath of test security, including the bottom section. It's the responsibility of the district campus to determine the most appropriate way to group students in order to provide a proper test administration. For STAR-L, ELLs might qualify for reading assistance as a linguistic accommodation. If an ELL taking STAR-L has a disability and meets the eligibility criteria, the student might also qualify for an oral administration. If providing an oral administration to a student taking a Braille test, refer to the document titled General Instructions for Administering Braille State Assessments, located on the Accommodations for Students with Disabilities webpage. If conducting assigned administration to students who are deaf or hard of hearing, test administrators should also read the specific guidelines for assigning test content included in the document titled General Instructions for Administering State Assessments to Students who are deaf or hard of hearing, located on the Accommodation for Students with Disabilities webpage. Spelling assistance. This accommodation provides a student with a disability with various types of spelling assistance, including, but not limited to, frequently misspelled word list, spell check function on a word processor, speech-to-text software. Dictionaries are a required part of standard test administration procedures and not considered a testing accommodation for some state assessments. For more information, refer to the STAR Dictionary policy on the STAR Resources webpage. For these assessments, any spelling assistance listed in the Examples Types section may be provided, along with the required dictionary, to a student who meets the eligibility criteria. If a student needs his or her typed response transcribed onto an answer document or into the assessment management system for online administration, refer to the Basic Transcribing Accommodation policy. Districts are required to have procedures in place to prevent the use of cell phones and personal electronic devices during test administrations. Electronic devices can disrupt the testing environment and compromise the security and confidentiality of the test. When using technology-based accommodations, students are not permitted internet access during testing. Electronic devices with internet or photographic capabilities are not allowed. Mathematics Manipulatives has changes for 2015. This accommodation allows for the use of manipulatives on mathematics assessments. Only the list of manipulatives below may be used. Specific guidance about each is in the accommodation document. Money, clocks, base 10 blocks, counters, algebra tiles, fraction pieces, geometric figures, translucent tracing paper. Any student who receives special education services or receives Section 504 services as a student identified with dyslexia or a related disorder may use this accommodation if he meets the eligibility criteria. Calculation devices. This accommodation provides an alternate method of computation for a student with a disability who is unable to effectively use paper and pencil methods. Only the list of devices below may be used. Specific guidance about each type is in accommodation document. A 4-function calculator, scientific calculator, graphing calculator, large key calculator, abacus or Cranmere modified abacus, audio graphing calculator, speech output calculator. Any student who receives special education or 504 services may use this accommodation if he or she meets the eligibility criteria. Grade 8 is listed because of Grade 8 Science. Grade 8 Mathematics does not apply since a calculator is required. What is considered a disability that affects mathematics calculation? A problem adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing using paper and pencil. The problem could be caused by a learning disability in mathematics. The problem could be caused by other conditions, ADHD, emotional or behavioral disability, processing or memory issue. The ARD or Section 504 committee decides if the student's disability causes him or her to have a problem calculating with pencil and paper. Why is a calculation device not allowed for grade 3 and 4 students who have disabilities that affect mathematics calculation? Students in grades 3 and 4 may use a calculator if they meet eligibility criteria. However, having a disability that affects mathematics calculation is not one of those criterion. The state curriculum at grades 3 and 4 includes student expectations that focus on students learning the algorithms for adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing. State assessments at these grades include test questions that measure calculation skills. It's important that students in grades 3 and 4 are given the time to learn these skills. Calculators used as an accommodation must adhere to the guidelines set forth in the STAR calculator policy. Calculators are a required part of a standard test administration procedures and not considered a testing accommodation for some state assessments. See the STAR calculator policy. For any assessments that require a scientific or graphing calculator, a simpler calculator can be provided along with the required calculator to a student receiving special education or 504 services. Districts are required to have procedures in place to prevent the use of cell phones and personal electronic devices during test administrations. Electronic devices can disrupt the testing environment and compromise the security and confidentiality of the test. When using technology-based accommodations, students are not permitted internet access during testing. Electronic devices with internet or photographic capabilities are not allowed. Basic transcribing. This accommodation allows a test administrator to transfer student responses to the answer document or in the assessment management system for online administrations in these situations only. The student writes or circles responses in a test booklet for multiple choice or griddable questions. The student points to responses in a test booklet or the computer screen for multiple choice questions. The student dictates or signs responses for multiple choice questions, griddable questions, or short answer reading questions. Student writes responses on another workspace, scratch paper or a dry erase board, or types responses on a word processor for multiple choice questions, griddable questions, short answer reading questions, or the writing prompts. Student uses speech-to-text software to indicate responses for multiple choice questions, griddable questions, short answer reading questions, or the writing prompts. Any student may use this accommodation if he or she meets the eligibility criteria. Test administrators should be trained in all transcription procedures located in this accommodation policy document and understand the boundaries of the assistance being provided. Test administrators must sign the oath of test security, including the bottom section. When transcribing the student's responses to griddable questions, the transcribing griddable questions student document must be printed and provided to each student who does not use his or her answer document so that the student is aware of the maximum number of boxes available for an answer to a griddable question. Any student responses typed or handwritten on scratch paper must be destroyed after testing. All voice recordings must be erased or destroyed after testing. The test administrator must indicate to the student the space allowed for his or her written compositions or short answer reading responses so that they will fit into the spaces provided when transcribed. Secure test materials and associated student responses cannot be photocopied, scanned, or saved in order to use this accommodation. Also refer to other accommodation policy if a student needs the test administrator to write for other reasons. Complex transcribing accommodation policy, the mathematics scribe accommodation policy, spelling assistance accommodation policy, manipulating test materials accommodation policy, or the general instructions for administering Braille state assessment, large print state assessments, or state assessments to students who are deaf or hard of hearing. Supplemental aids also has changes for 2015. This accommodation allows a student with a disability access to paper-based resources that assist with recalling information. Only the following types of supplemental aids may be used: mnemonic devices, blank graphic organizers, certain types of mathematics charts, certain types of mathematics, science, and social studies graphics, grammar, and mechanics rules. Any student who receives special education services or receives Section 504 services as a student identified with dyslexia or a related disorder may use this accommodation if he meets the eligibility criteria. Examples of allowable and non-allowable supplemental aids are available in a training PowerPoint on the Accommodations for Students with Disabilities webpage. Supplemental aids can be provided in the language that is most appropriate for the student. Supplemental aids, like all accommodations, should be individualized for each student. It is not appropriate to provide all students the exact same set of supplemental aids. Extra time, same day. Any student may use this accommodation if he or she meets the eligibility criteria. Extra time testing sessions for grades 3 through 8 and EOC should start at the beginning of the school day and may go until the end of the regularly scheduled school day. Extra time testing sessions must never extend beyond a typical 7-hour school day for any one student. Schools that do not have typical 7-hour schedules should contact TEA for guidance. Specific eligibility criteria for extra time as a linguistic accommodation are found in the document titled Linguistic Accommodations for ELLs Participating in the STAR program, located on the Accommodation Resources webpage. Large print. This accommodation allows for state-provided large print test materials. The ordering process of large print materials will be closely monitored to ensure districts are ordering only for those students who meet the eligibility criteria. Student responses must be transcribed onto an answer document according to the procedures outlined in the basic transcribing or complex transcribing accommodation policies. Helpful resources to refer to: general instructions for administering large print state assessments, font and point size matrices, Coordinator Manual Resources webpage for more information about the special request process for a paper administration of any online test. If a student needs a test booklet in a larger print size than offered in the large print test materials provided by the state, refer to the photocopying test materials accommodation policy. Dictionary. This accommodation allows for the use of a dictionary to assist with comprehension of unfamiliar words and/or spelling. Only the following types of dictionaries may be used. More specific guidance about each is in the accommodation document. A standard general dictionary in English or Spanish, dictionary thesaurus combination, electronic dictionary, bilingual dictionary, ESL, picture, or sign language dictionary. Any student who receives special education or 504 services may use this accommodation for grades 3 through 5 reading tests and the grade 4 writing test if he or she meets the eligibility criteria. Dictionaries are a required part of standard test administration procedures and not considered a testing accommodation for some state assessments. Refer to the STAR dictionary policy located on the STAR Resources webpage. If a student in grade 6 or above needs a dictionary not listed in this policy, contact TEA's Accommodation Task Force. Teacher-made or student-made dictionaries are not allowed. Information about the use of dictionaries as a linguistic accommodation can be found in the document titled Linguistic Accommodations for ELLs Participating in the STAR program on the Linguistic Accommodations for ELLs Taking STAR webpage. Braille. This accommodation allows for state-provided Braille test materials for a student receiving special education or Section 504 services as a student with a visual impairment and who routinely uses Braille materials in the classroom. Student responses on Braille tests must be transcribed onto an answer document according to the procedures outlined in the basic transcribing or complex transcribing accommodation policies. Review the document General Instructions for Administering Braille State Assessments. Specific Braille instructions supplement the test administrator manuals. They are shipped with the individual Braille kits and posted online. Test administrators must review the SBIs prior to test day to ensure that the test is administered properly. Testing irregularities could result if the SBIs are not used. Type 1 Accommodations Chart. Type 2 Accommodations. Complex transcribing applies only to Grade 4 written composition, Grade 7, English 1, English 2 written composition. This accommodation allows a test administrator to record onto an answer document or in the assessment management system for Star A student's dictated or signed responses to their writing prompts when a student with a disability is unable to accomplish this task independently. An accommodation request form may be submitted to TEA if the student meets the following eligibility criteria. Complex transcribing is intended for students who are physically unable to produce a written response. This accommodation is not intended for students who have spelling deficits or poor handwriting. Approved accommodation request forms are returned to the district with very specific guidelines about how to transcribe the student's responses to the writing prompts, including how to indicate the student's spelling, punctuation, and capitalization. A test administrator who transcribes for a student must be trained in these guidelines so that he or she understands the boundaries of the assistance being provided. Test administrators must sign the oath of test security, including the bottom section. Any scratch paper must be destroyed after testing. Mathematics scribes applies only to mathematics and science tests. This accommodation allows a test administrator to record a student's dictated scratch work and computations when a disabling condition prevents the student from accomplishing this task independently. Test administrators may write the student's dictated scratch work and computations onto scratch paper, a chalkboard, a whiteboard, or the student's test booklet. An accommodation request form may be submitted to TEA if the student meets the following eligibility criteria. Allowable test administration procedures and materials referred to in the Student Eligibility Criteria section of this document can be found on the Accommodations webpage. Approved accommodation request forms are returned to the district with very specific guidelines about how to carry out this accommodation. A test administrator who serves as a math scribe must be trained in these guidelines so that he or she understands the boundaries of the assistance being provided. Test administrators must sign the oath of test security, including the bottom section. Any scratch paper must be destroyed after testing. Photocopying test materials. This accommodation allows for test materials to be photocopied for eligible students by a trained administrator who has signed the oath of test security, including the bottom section. An accommodation request form may be submitted to TEA if the student receives special education services and meets the following eligibility criteria. Allowable test administration procedures and materials referred to in the Student Eligibility Criteria section of this document can be found on the Accommodations webpage. Approved accommodation request forms are returned to the district with very specific guidelines about how to carry out this accommodation. A test administrator who photocopies secure test material must be trained in these guidelines. For more information about the special request process for a paper administration of any online test, go to the Coordinator Manual Resources webpage. Documents that can be photocopied without an accommodation request: test administrator directions, blank answer documents, state-supplied mathematics graph paper, state-supplied reference materials for Grade 8 Science and Algebra 1. Extra day. An accommodation request form may be submitted to TEA if the student meets the following eligibility criteria. This accommodation allows for 1 extra day to test. Each day of testing must not extend beyond 7 hours. TEA will provide additional procedures specific to the requested accommodation with any approved accommodation request form. Allowable test administration procedures and materials referred to in the Student Eligibility Criteria section of this document can be found on the Accommodations webpage. Other accommodations that fall into this category are only for students with disabilities who have unique needs that are not specifically addressed in the accommodation triangle, not intended to provide additional supplemental aids not listed as allowable, not intended for students who fail to meet established eligibility criteria. Standard accommodations do not invalidate test results. Non-standard accommodations invalidate what is being assessed. An accommodation request form may be submitted to TEA if the student meets the following eligibility criteria. The district testing coordinator has been advised by a member of TEA's accommodations task force that the accommodation fits into the category of other. Accommodation resources. Accommodation request process for Type 2 accommodations. Only Type 2 accommodations require the submission of an accommodation request form to TEA. Do not submit an accommodation request form if the student does not meet the specific eligibility criteria. For complex transcribing, photocopying test materials, extra day, mathematics scribe, or other. The accommodation request form can only be submitted to TEA by the campus testing coordinator. Step 1, determination of student eligibility for a Type 2 accommodation. Step 2, completion and submission of the online form. Step 3, TEA review and decision. Step 4, required communication within district. When completing the online accommodation request form, be prepared to provide specific detailed information about the reason the student needs the accommodation. Do not include confidential student information. The request will be deleted and you will be asked to resubmit. Do not include student's first and last name, social security number, pages from an IEP, or medical documents. The district testing coordinator is the primary contact person for schools when questions arise. Before submitting the request to TEA, please contact the district testing coordinator for guidance. Once the campus testing coordinator submits the form to TEA, the district testing coordinator receives an email from TEA asking for approval to process the accommodation request form. The DTC will review to check that all required information and documentation has been included in the request. The district campus testing coordinator must ensure that the test administrator receives special training to administer an assessment with an approved accommodation if special guidelines accompany the approved request. Accommodation requests must be approved by TEA before a student can use the accommodation on a state assessment. Documentation and the appropriate paperwork should be pending TEA approval. Type 2 accommodations submitted and approved in 2015 are valid through December 31st, 2015. General instructions for administering large print state assessments. If a student has a visual impairment and needs printed materials in a size larger than the state-supplied large print materials, refer to the photocopying test materials accommodation policy. Font and point size matrices for all test programs located on Accommodations for Students with Disabilities webpage. STAR L, STAR A, and TELPAS reading tests are administered online. However, if a student is not able to access an online assessment, even with appropriate technology-based accommodations, a request for a large print paper test may be submitted to TEA. For more information about the specific request process for a paper administration of any online test, go to the Coordinator Manual Resources webpage. General instructions for administering state assessment to students who are deaf or hard of hearing. Test administrators must receive training in the procedures and special instruction in this document prior to testing. Information about the following topics can be found in this document: who may serve as test administrators, testing accommodations, including how to provide assigned administration of test content to eligible students. Refer to the Oral Administration Accommodation Policy for information about eligibility for assigned administration. This includes special instructions for students taking Star L and Star A. Certain procedures and materials are allowed for any student who needs them and is taking a state assessment. They are available to any student who regularly benefits from the use of these procedures or materials during instruction, although a student cannot be required to use them during testing. In some cases, a student may need to complete the test in a separate setting in order to eliminate distractions to other students and to ensure that the security and confidentiality of the tests are maintained. Below are the allowable test administration procedures and materials. If you have any questions, please contact your campus testing coordinator.